All right, so let's dive into something pretty big happening in the financial world.
Yeah.
It's China's first ever sovereign green bonds.
Yeah. It's
They were
exact.
issued this past April on the London Stock Exchange. And it's a pretty fascinating look into China's plans when it comes to green finance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really significant moment, like kind of a marker in the sand when it comes to China's approach to sustainable finance.
Yeah, it's not just another bond offering, right? This was a pretty huge deal.
No, exactly. This is their first sovereign green bond issuance.
Right.
And even more significantly, it's their first ever sovereign bond in an overseas market.
Yeah, and they raised a ton of money too, like 6 billion yuan,
Right, which is,
which is roughly $830 million.
yeah, about $830 million.
And what's really interesting is the response they got from investors. I mean, the demand was off the charts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the investor appetite here really tells a story.
It was oversubscribed 6.9 times.
Wow.
So they ended up with over 41 billion yuan in subscriptions.
Yeah, that's huge. That kind of demand really speaks volumes.
Yeah, it definitely shows a lot of confidence in China's commitment to this, right?
I think so. And not just confidence in their creditworthiness,
Right.
but also potentially, an indication that there just aren't enough high quality green investment opportunities out there right now.
Right.
And maybe even a little bit of strategic pricing by China to really pull in that global capital, make it really attractive.
And the structure of the bonds themselves was interesting too, right? They did a dual-tranche offering.
Okay.
So 3-year bonds at 1.88% and 5-year bonds at 1.93%.
Right. And those rates are very competitive, especially compared to comparable Hong Kong Treasury bonds. So the appeal is definitely there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just investors from one region either. It was a really diverse mix geographically, which is really important for a global issuance like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what I thought was really fascinating was the breakdown. You know, 22% of the subscriptions came from investors specifically focused on green and sustainable assets.
Right. That's a big chunk of dedicated capital. That's not just window dressing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It shows that this is becoming a really central part of investment strategies all over the world.
Absolutely.
And we should mention, too, just the sheer caliber of institutions that were involved in facilitating this whole thing.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, we're talking major players on the international stage. The Bank of China, HSBC, Barclays, and a whole bunch of others were the joint lead managers and book runners.
It was a who's who of finance, for sure.
And then you had Credit Agricole, CIB, and Bank of China acting as green structuring advisors.
Right. And that just shows you how seriously everyone's taking this whole green finance thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the market reception was clearly a huge endorsement.
For sure.
But let's get into the nitty-gritty here. What actually makes these bonds green? I know there's a specific framework they're based on.
Yeah, right. So there's this document called the People's Republic of China's Sovereign Green Bond Framework. And what's really noteworthy here is that this is the first time China's created a framework like this that's been reviewed by both Chinese and international reviewers, these what they call second-party opinion providers.
So they're really making sure that everyone's on the same page about what green actually means.
Exactly.
Kind of bridging that gap between maybe some local interpretations and global standards.
Yeah, I mean, there have been issues in the past, right?
Right.
Where what one country might consider green doesn't quite line up with expectations elsewhere.
Yeah, like the whole debate around clean coal, for example.
Exactly. And that was a big sticking point for a lot of international investors.
So by aligning with those well-established international standards, China is really trying to be proactive and increase transparency and build trust.
Exactly.
And I think it's important to note that it wasn't just China saying, hey, trust us, these are green.
No, they actually brought in DNV, an independent assurance and risk management firm, to do their own assessment. Essentially verifying that, yeah, this framework really does line up with the ICMA principles. So that's an extra layer of reassurance for investors who want to know their money's actually going to legitimate green initiatives.
Makes sense. So where does the money actually go?
That's the big question.
Yeah, what are they actually funding with these bonds?
So the framework is very clear on this. All the proceeds go towards financing or refinancing eligible green expenditures that are already part of the Ministry of Finance's budget.
Okay, so it's all very carefully planned and allocated.
Yeah, exactly.
So what kinds of projects fall under that eligible green umbrella?
So they've outlined several key environmental objectives.
Okay.
Starting with climate change mitigation, think renewable energy and energy efficiency improvements, things like that.
Right.
Then you've got climate change adaptation, which might involve investing in infrastructure to deal with the impacts of climate change, things like flood defenses.
Makes sense.
Then there's natural resource conservation, so things like sustainable forestry or land management. And of course, pollution prevention and control initiatives, and importantly, biodiversity conservation efforts.
So it's a pretty broad range of areas.
It's comprehensive.
But they get more specific than that too, right?
Right. So within those broader categories, they have more detailed examples like investments in clean transportation, electric vehicles, public transport, things like that.
Right.
Sustainable water and wastewater management.
Okay.
Sustainable management of natural resources and land use.
Makes sense.
Protection of marine ecosystems, and even projects focused on resource utilization and recycling.
So really promoting that circular economy.
Exactly. And here's another important point. These eligible projects also have to meet the criteria set out in China's Green Bond Endorsed Projects Catalog, which was updated in 2021. So there's this very clear link between this bond issuance and China's broader national green policies.
So it's not just a standalone initiative. It's part of a bigger picture.
Exactly. And that catalog is essentially a list of pre-approved green project types. It's very detailed and specific.
Okay, so we've got a good understanding of what these bonds are and how they work. But I'm curious about the bigger picture. Where does this fit into China's overall strategy?
Right. So to understand that, we need to go back to the idea of ecological civilization, which has been a guiding principle in China's governance since 2013.
Right. I've heard that term before.
Yeah, it's essentially a philosophy that emphasizes harmony between humans and nature, and it's really woven into their approach to development.
So it's not just an environmental policy, it's a whole way of thinking about how they approach progress.
Exactly, and it forms the foundation for all their green finance initiatives.
And of course, we can't forget about China's climate commitments, right?
Right, the big ones they announced in 2020.
Yeah, peaking carbon emissions before 2030 and achieving carbon neutrality by 2060.
Those are huge goals, and they're going to require massive investments.
Absolutely. And they've clearly identified green bonds as a key tool for achieving those targets.
Absolutely.
So this isn't just a one-off. This is part of a much larger long-term plan. And it seems like China's green bond market has already seen some pretty impressive growth over the past decade.
It has. By the end of 2021, it was one of the largest in the world, almost $200 billion in green bonds issued.
Wow. And in 2021 alone, they hit a record $68.2 billion in new issuances.
That's right.
And actually, by 2023, China had become the world leader in terms of annual green bond issuance volume.
Yeah, it's been remarkable.
But it's important to keep things in perspective, right?
Yeah.
Even with all that growth, green bonds still only make up about 1% of China's total bond market.
Right.
So there's still a ton of room for expansion.
Absolutely. Huge potential for growth.
And it sounds like the regulatory environment has been changing as well to support this growth in green finance.
Yeah, absolutely. In the early days, there were some inconsistencies in what actually qualified as a green project and how the money from green bonds was actually being used.
Right, those different definitions of green that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But we've seen some really significant improvements lately.
Like what specifically?
Well, the introduction of the harmonized Green Bond Endorsed Projects Catalog in 2021 and the updated China Green Bond Principles in 2022 were huge.
Okay.
Now, 100% of the proceeds from certified green bonds have to be used for eligible green projects.
So that eliminates a lot of the ambiguity.
Exactly. And that standardization and alignment with international norms have really been key in building trust among global investors and paving the way for this sovereign green bond issuance.
Makes sense. So beyond just funding green projects, are there other strategic objectives at play here for China?
I think so, yeah.
What else might they be hoping to achieve with this?
Well, firstly, I think it's a significant step towards the internationalization of the RMB.
Right, their currency.
Yeah, exactly. By listing these bonds in RMB on the London Stock Exchange, they're really increasing the global presence and use of their currency.
And London is a pretty strategic choice, right? It's a major global financial hub.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the perfect platform for China to raise the profile of the RMB.
And of course, this also strengthens the financial ties between China and the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. It builds on that dialogue they had in early 2025 where they discussed this whole initiative.
Yeah, so it's not just about green finance. It's also about geopolitics and strengthening relationships.
Exactly. It's all connected.
You mentioned earlier that this sovereign issuance could act as a benchmark for other Chinese entities looking to issue green bonds.
Right. So what this does is it establishes a clear reference point in terms of pricing,
Okay.
the structure of the bonds, the environmental standards they adhere to, sets a precedent.
And that makes it easier for others to follow suit.
Exactly. You know, Wen Hongji from the Climate Bonds Initiative said it really well. This sets a pricing benchmark for future RMB-denominated green bonds coming out of China.
So it reduces uncertainty and risk?
Yeah, exactly. It
Okay.
makes it easier for local governments, financial institutions, corporations to issue their own green bonds.
So it's like the central government is taking the lead and setting a good example for everyone else to follow.
Precisely.
And the impact of this could be much broader than just pricing right.
Right. It has the potential to be a catalyst for the whole environmental finance ecosystem in China.
Oh, so.
Well, it could encourage greater diversification in the global green bond market, attract a wider range of international investors, and even accelerate the development of domestic green finance infrastructure.
So things like better verification processes, more transparent reporting standards, better ways to measure the environmental impact of these projects.
Exactly. And the involvement of international investors brings a valuable exchange of knowledge and best practices.
Yeah, that cross-pollination of ideas can be really powerful.
Absolutely.
It's really interesting to look at this in a global context, too. How does China's approach to sovereign green bonds compare to what other major economies are doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting to note that China and the U.S. were actually among the last of the world's 10 largest economies to issue sovereign ESG bonds.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of other countries were already ahead of the game.
So what sets China apart then?
Well, a couple of things. For one, they already had a pretty substantial domestic green bond market, mostly driven by corporations, before they even issued a sovereign green bond.
So they were already laying the groundwork.
Exactly. And unlike many other countries that typically issue their sovereign green bonds in US dollars or euros, China chose to do it in offshore RMB.
Right, which goes back to that strategic goal of internationalizing their currency.
Exactly. It's a two birds with one stone kind of situation.
And their green bond framework seems a bit broader than some others too, right?
It is, yeah. While a lot of other countries tend to focus mainly on climate change mitigation, China's framework includes a wider range of objectives.
Like what specifically?
Well, we talked about it earlier, but it includes natural resource conservation, pollution prevention, and controlled biodiversity conservation.
Right.
It's a reflection of that ecological civilization philosophy we discussed.
Makes sense. And of course, they're really emphasizing alignment with both the domestic and international standards, which helps build credibility.
Yeah, for sure.
And finally, the choice to list on the London Stock Exchange rather than just in mainland China signals their intention to engage with international investors and attract that global capital.
Absolutely.
So bringing it all together, it seems like this first sovereign green bond from China is a pretty significant development.
It is. It's a major step forward for their green finance ambitions, a boost for the RMB, and a clear demonstration of their commitment to global sustainability standards.
And the overwhelming investor response shows a lot of confidence in their approach.
Absolutely. The level of oversubscription was a clear vote of confidence.
This feels like it could be a real turning point shaping the future of China's green bond market and its role in the global environmental finance ecosystem.
I agree. It sets a precedent and creates a lot of momentum for continued growth in this area.
This has been a really insightful look at the intersection of global finance strategic goals
Yeah.
and the pressing need to address environmental challenges.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study with far-reaching implications.
It really makes you think about the potential impact if more countries started issuing sovereign green bonds in their own currencies rather than relying on the dominant reserve currencies.
That's a great question to ponder.
What kind of shifts could we see in the global financial landscape and in our collective efforts to build a more sustainable future?
Hmm.
It's definitely something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, it was great to be here.